a little bit about my story. I came to climate activism quite young. I just left uni when I was about 22. And I got involved in this little project called Hope for the Future at my local church. And we'd got a little bit of funding, and the idea was to try and research the best techniques for lobbying politicians on climate change. And I got so excited about the opportunity to do something about climate change. I got so excited about the fact that my day job was being able to turn up and do something about climate change. And whenever I felt anxious about climate change and the nature crisis, I would just throw myself into the work. And the fortunate thing for me was that this work was going well, and things started to grow, and we started to gain staff, and suddenly I found myself running this charity that was working nationally, and I was still quite young, and you know what it's like in the third sector. There wasn't a lot of budget for training and those kinds of things, and I was just so keen, so fired up, so passionate, so enthusiastic. But little warning bells started to go off in my mind. I started to kind of struggle to switch off, and I started to think, well, what if we don't manage to turn this thing around? Then what? And these intrusive thoughts were coming in. I thought, no, I'm going to shut them out. And then my body started talking to me. I started getting kind of strange aches and pains, and I was very tired, and I wasn't eating properly, and I had a cold, and then a virus, and then another cold. And my friends noticed that I wasn't quite the same. And essentially, I was experiencing a burnout, and I wasn't really aware of it because I was so passionate about the work, and I so wanted to do something about it. And I'd seen other colleagues burn out. I'd seen other people go through this process, and I thought, I'm immune. That's not going to happen to me. I'm not the kind of person that happens to. And my turning point was when I ended up in A&E with kind of chest pains that no one could explain, and it was clearly stress, and I was struggling to breathe. And then from that point onwards, I was in and out of hospital with various other things, and I thought, this is no good. So I thought, I'll take a 6-month sabbatical, I'll go back, it'll be fine. And it was actually when I stopped, that was when my burnout came crashing in, and I just found, one day I just could not get out of bed. And there are, huge kind of, burnout is a scale, but I had it very, very bad, and I did not see it coming. And I thought, that's why I'm done with climate activism. And until I sort of, I was praying about it and wondering what to do. And I thought, it can't just be me that feels this way. And of course it isn't. And so I decided I would use my recovery from burnout, and I got a little bit of funding to do this, to use my recovery as a kind of research project. Like, how is resilience affected by our knowledge of climate change and the nature crisis, and how is that affecting our well-being, and how do we build resilience against this? And so I retrained after I recovered in the well-being space, and that's how I came to do the work that I do. So this work for me it's incredibly personal. And I also think that, the kinds of structures and pressures that drove me to burnout, that attitude to myself of just extracting resources from myself without replenishing them, is so similar to the mindset that leads us into climate change and leads us to this challenge and this crisis of where we are. And so actually, so much of my attitude towards climate change has shifted as I've realized I can't fix what's happening in the world with the same mindset that caused it. This inner work in myself is as much part of activism, and changing first my own attitude to my own body and my own little life, and that overflowing outwards. I used to think, growing up as a Christian, I would work so much with that image of, we would learn about Jesus pouring himself out, and I wanted to be like, I wanted to pour myself out till I was empty, and that that stopped working for me, and God called me out of that, and I felt God gave me a different image, and that was, no, I want to fill up your cup so that it overflows to other people. And that's the kind of sustainable activism that I want to see you doing, Jo. So that's really how I came to do what I do, to be very upfront with you about my approach, which is all about how do we fill up our cups so that we can overflow to others. That's what I want to share with you. So to do that, I wanted to say a little bit more about kind of burnout and some of the challenges of being aware of climate change and the nature crisis. And then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. So you'll see here, just right, when I'm doing this, I can't see the chat. So if I miss anything, I'm sorry. But when I come back off, if anything's in the chat, I'll have a little look once I stop screen sharing. So you can see here, I've put climate sorrow. And you might have heard people talk about eco-anxiety, for example. This kind of sense of, or the official definition is chronic existential dread of environmental doom. And eco-anxiety is often used as an umbrella term for the grief that we feel about the state of the world, and the anger and the overwhelm and the guilt, and yes, the fear and the anxiety, and all of these challenging emotions. But one of the difficulties with the idea of eco-anxiety is it kind of medicalizes what is actually a very natural, normal, healthy response to what is happening in the world. So I found myself starting to work with the idea of climate sorrow, just like all of these emotions of the sorrow that we carry about the state of the world. So a little bit about burnout and how that's fed into by climate sorrow. So you may have heard there are 5 stages of burnout. And so if you're thinking about perhaps where you are in terms of your own resilience, this could be a helpful tool. So we have the honeymoon phase. So when we first come to the work, a bit like I described, like it's so wonderful to know I can do something about this. And that can be characterized if we're prone to burnout with kind of an all or nothing approach, throwing everything we have at it, like holding nothing back for ourselves. Even if we're really enjoying it and it feels great, that means we're already in the first stage of burnout. The second stage is the onset of stress. So that's when I talked about, when these sort of intrusive thoughts were coming in, or I noticed that I was kind of feeling a bit cynical or more irritable with other people, or more anxious, or I was having more kind of depressed thoughts. But also in my body, just strange aches and pains, and just a general feeling of tiredness. I was starting to kind of eat food for energy more, and I wasn't wanting to get out and do my usual things. So that's the kind of onset of stress. Chronic stress was when that really started to take a toll on my body, and I was really starting to think, gosh, what is the point in all of this? I was starting to feel trapped, like I don't want to give up my value of doing everything I can for the planet, and yet I don't feel like I'm coping, and I don't know how to navigate that. And then burnout is that, what I've described, that kind of sense of just like, I just can't carry on like this. And the 5th stage is habitual burnout. So that's where I really did myself quite a lot of damage, as I would, kind of experience of like, I can't do this anymore, take a little bit of time out for myself. I'd have a few days off work or go on holiday, give myself a bit of resourcing, and come back and then just burn out again and sort of go down this negative cycle. If you feel like you're at risk of burnout, and it may be that you're not here because you're burning out or you're at risk of burnout, it may just be that actually you're interested in how to manage a particular aspect of climate sorrow, such as eco-anxiety, or it may be that you just want to have that renewed sense of joy and lightness in your activism and passion. And there'll be plenty for you if that's the case. But if burnout is something you're specifically struggling with, I would highly recommend this book, The Joy of Burnout by Dr. Dina Gluberman. And her take on burnout is that it's actually a massive gift. And I have grown to completely agree. And the gift of burnout is that actually we burn out because something is no longer sustainable. A way of working that once worked for us is no longer sustainable. And burnout is there to tell us there's a different way. And I didn't want to hear that. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to listen to my mind and my body. I didn't want to listen to what God was saying to me. I just wanted to carry on, carry on, carry on. And the gift of my burnout experience is that not only do I approach my climate activism differently, but I approach the whole of my life differently. I often talk about this idea of the urgency of climate change. It makes us feel like it's a sprint, but it's not. It's actually a marathon, and it's kind of not even a marathon. It's actually just like a very, very, very long walk. It's more like a pilgrimage. I'm using that imagery because I walked the Camino pilgrimage in Spain last month, and that was so powerful for me, and realizing, like, yes, it's actually about turning up every single day in the best way that we can, and that is a long haul thing. This is not a battle that we can kind of win by outrunning it. So that's a little bit about kind of burnout, and a little bit as well about what is it about climate activism that makes that presents such a challenge to our resilience. What's specific about climate activism? And these are some of the things that people say to me in my research. So the first is it's all encompassing. You know, with other social justice issues, we may be able to, you know, go home and switch off and do some activities where that particular thing isn't touched by the issue that we care about. But with climate change and the nature crisis, you can't really get out of bed without in some way being confronted with a lifestyle choice or you know, or an impact of climate change. And so there's no getting away from it, there's no switching off from it. It's all encompassing and it's overwhelming. There's also this kind of dual thing of knowing, this sense of responsibility, like I can do something about this, I should do everything I can, I'm part of the solution, but also I'm part of the problem. There's this guilt, there's this sense of, gosh, you know, when I go to the supermarket to buy something, everything's wrapped in plastic. You know, these systems that we're born into mean that we inherently cause harm just by moving. And that can make us feel so conflicted as well, and kind of trapped by this as an issue. There's this question of, how do I know if I've ever done enough, which is so hard? How can I say, yes, it's okay to switch off, yes, it's okay to take time for me? And there's also this collective societal silence around climate change and the nature crisis, and this sense of, am I normal to feel like this? You know, when we're having these moments of real kind of fear or anxiety or anger or whatever it is, it's still difficult to talk about it with some of our friends or in a family context or in a work context. You know, we watch the news and it's like people still aren't able to see what a challenge this is and what a crisis this is. And that can be incredibly isolating. And there was some research that came out a few years ago about climate scientists and their well-being, and they, you know, researching climate impacts, and then they were having to write up about it. And what came back consistently from that research was that the observation of the climate impacts wasn't the most traumatic aspect of their work. What was most traumatic was trying to communicate that to the public and feeling that it fell on deaf ears. So that sense of isolation and loneliness, and this not being held by everyone, because as humans, that's what we're designed to do. We're designed to hold things in community. So these are some of the challenges that we're working with. And at this point, I wanted to take a pause and just give us the opportunity to just have a few moments to actually share with each other, like, what's on your heart? What's difficult for you about your climate sorrow? So the question I'm asking you is, what do you find challenging about caring for creation? And it can be amazing the difference it can make, just having the opportunity to say that to other people. So we're going to put you into small groups and of about 3, and you'll have, I think we'll go for 6 minutes, so 2 minutes each, roughly, and share whatever you like. that you find difficult about this. It's your space to just get some stuff off your chest. And if you're listening to someone else, I just encourage you, it could be so tempting to want to jump in and fix it or offer advice, but try and resist the temptation to do that and just to hear and to hold what's being shared. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So yeah, questions. What's challenging for you emotionally about caring for creation and about your climate activism? And I believe Hannah is going to put us all into our small groups. Thank you. Okay, great. Hopefully we're all back and no one got lost in the internet somewhere between their breakout room and here. I wonder if there's something maybe that or maybe we'll do that in a bit. Okay. So there's a model that I'd like to share with you that's helped me hugely with the challenges that I have with regards to my own resilience. And for that, I'm going to share my screen with you again. So this is something called the window of tolerance model. You may have come across it before. It's actually taken from trauma theory, and the idea is that we have a window of tolerance, which is represented here by the rainbow, and within our window of tolerance we feel resilient, so we feel responsive, we feel able to engage, we feel creative, grounded, compassionate, strategic, and we can see a problem, we can face that problem, aka the nature crisis, and we feel that there's something we can do, and we know, at least we might not know how to fix it, we almost certainly can't know how to fix it, but we know what our next right thing is that we want to do. Outside of our window of tolerance, we can get pushed further and further outside of our window of tolerance when things become very stressful, or they're really getting to us, we're really feeling pressurized, we're perhaps not taking enough time out for ourselves, or it's just really getting to us. We move into one of two states, and we can ping pong between these states as well. So the first of those, which we probably all have moments of at least, is despair. This sense of, I just can't do this, we can't do this, it's all hopeless, we may as well give up. And it's this kind of, in a bodily sensation, it's like zzz, and it's completely immobilizing. You may experience that, you know, as symptoms of depression, for example, or anxiety. But the other side of the window of tolerance that you'll see is denial, and that's why sometimes our brains, when something is too traumatic or stressful, we just shut off and we go, no, it's not happening, it's not happening. And that's why climate denial is as much a symptom of eco-anxiety as climate despair is, or eco-anxiety is. It's just our brain's way of protecting ourselves. And so this can be really helpful in terms of understanding our own responses and knowing, okay, I need to do some self-care because I'm moving into one of these two states. But also understanding other people. So like, I cannot understand why, why this person won't, for example, acknowledge this problem. Probably because their brain is going, no, it's too scary, I can't. So self-care is what actually brings us back into our window of tolerance, and not just self-care, but also communal care, holding each other and just being able to share what's on our hearts and be heard by others. So I just encourage you to take a sec to think, what are the signs for you that you may have entered into despair? What does that look like for you? So you can kind of recognize it when it's happening, like, I know what this is. And also, what are the signs for you that you may have entered into denial? I encourage you just to spend a sec thinking about that. And it's okay to it's actually quite helpful to take trips to both despair and denial at points. It's good to enter into our climate grief and to express it and our sense of hopelessness, because if we don't express it, it can get stuck inside us. But it's not a place we want to stay in as much as possible. And the same for denial. It's good sometimes to go, do you know what? I'm putting a boundary in place. I'm not going to think about that right now. I'm having a week off or an evening off or whatever. But then again, it's good not to stay in that place. So let me check what my next slide is. Yep. So time to stop sharing my screen with you again. So just want to ask you to have a think. What helps you stay within your window of tolerance? Maybe one or two things that helps you, and then share that in the chat, because it would be great to hear other people's ideas of what looks like resilience building or self-care for you. What helps you stay in your window of tolerance? And pop it in the chat so that we can share some ideas with each other. And then I'm going to share with you some of my own ideas. Okay, so we have prayer, exercise and food. Going for a long cycle ride really helps me. Chatting with friends, running, time on my own, introversion time, yes. Being strict about a day off, Sabbath, a proper day off, so important, so important. Movement, being in nature, lots of nature here, walking in nature, seeing other people, buy plastic-free veg, yes. There are days when I can't bear to look at the newspaper. I know it's full of dire stuff, so it's not denial in that sense. I just need a break, so I have it. Absolutely. Being by the sea, listening to an inspirational podcast. Remember, God cares more than me. I love that. Loads of ideas, loads of ways that we're all already doing things to look after ourselves and acknowledging, actually, yes, self-care and planet care are two sides of the same coin, and I need to fill up my cup so that I can keep giving out to other people. Singing, making a joyful noise, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to share with you four suggestions for resilience building that someone else has put there as well. Exercise in nature, that have really helped me, and you can take this framework and put your own take on it, absolutely. And it's something that can be fit into your day in half an hour if it needs to be, or it could be a framework that you use to cover many hours of your day. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. Right, hopefully you can all see that. So there are four things, and they all begin with gr, to help me remember them. So the first of those is grace. And for each of these, I've included a Bible verse. So I've got here, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So the idea of grace for me is taking some kind of time out for rest, and to remember that my purpose in being here on this earth is to be and to enjoy and to savor what God has made. And that actually, I might beat myself up for not doing more, or not having done more sooner, or for not doing more better. But actually, I know that God uses my weaknesses and uses my imperfections for God's plan, and therefore it is good for me to take rests. And it's something Jesus in his ministry took so much time out for, time with friends, for resting, for being at weddings, for eating food together. In his ministry, it was a ministry filled with joy. So it practically, what grace might look like for you is your prayer time. It might be a nap. It might be that you're having your morning tea, and instead of scrolling your phone for the latest news, you actually go, no, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to enjoy my cup of tea and reconnect with my sense of being in the world rather than doing in the world. And it's such a radical and countercultural act. So that's the first, some kind of stillness practice. Practically speaking, you know, if we do have a practice that we can actually slow down and listen to what's going on inside of ourselves, this is so helpful for emotional regulation, because you can begin to take on the role of the observer. Like, oh, I'm noticing, like we talked about with the window of tolerance, oh, I'm noticing I'm moving into despair, or oh, I'm noticing that I'm moving into denial. And rather than getting caught up in it, we can notice it and we can hand it to God, and we can say, okay, you know, what do I need to do? What do I need to do to be able to tend to myself? So I aim for at least 10 minutes of stillness a day. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's a lot more, depending on what I feel I need. But that's the first resilience strategy, the stopping, the putting the boundaries in place. I'm not going to read any more of that. I'm not going to do any more of that. I'm going to remember my place before God as God's creation, as a being rather than a doing. My second suggestion is grounding, my second word. So by grounding, what I mean is, if we are feeling stressed, what we tend to do is get more and more caught up in our thoughts. We're worrying about the future, we're ruminating on the past, it's quite hard to be present in the moment. We're stressing about this, that, and the other. What grounding does, and what I mean by grounding, is coming out of our heads and into our bodies. So a lot of you mentioned exercise and nature, which are two fantastic grounding practices. Moving our bodies. For me, my favorite grounding exercise, I just put some music on in the morning and I have a dance. Moving our bodies is so important for releasing emotions. They get stuck in our bodies if we aren't processing our emotions, and movement can actually help to release those. And the same with nature, actually using our senses. It might be that we take some time out to really savor our food and ground ourselves in our taste buds. It could be that we go out for a walk and we feel the air on our faces. Some sort of way in which, either through movement or our senses, we get out of our heads into our bodies. And that has the dual benefit of just giving our tired minds a break, but also activates our parasympathetic nervous system. So it activates our rest and digest mode, our healing mode. We're not kind of in the fight, flight, do. We're in the other mode, the rest, digest, heal mode. And it's grounding, getting into our bodies, that can really activate that. My Bible verse for this one I've chosen: you have turned my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, from Psalm 30. So thinking then about the way in which the Bible is talking about how we can take our mourning and our sorrow and our challenges, and we can actually we can shift that through dance and through movement. And it's a very embodied Bible verse, you know, about putting sackcloth on, and this sense of how our emotions are tied up in our bodies and in ritual, rather than just getting stuck up in our heads. So that's grounding. I try to, if I'm really pressed for time, when I was back at sort of working really, really hard, I would do like 10 minutes at least of grounding, a bit of stretching, a bit of walking, a bit of running. Now I try to do quite a bit more than that. Third practice is gratitude. The third we've got grace, grounding, gratitude. So gratitude is absolutely a muscle that we can practice. We are not wired to feel grateful as a species, and it's not because we're ungrateful or anything like that. It's just because we're excellent at survival. So when our ancestors came out of their caves back in the day, and they perhaps were confronted with a hungry lion and a rainbow, the ancestors that came out and stood there and went, oh, the rainbow is so beautiful, they would have got eaten by that hungry lion, and they would have died, and they would have not been able to pass on their genes. Whereas the ancestors that came out and saw the hungry lion but ignored the rainbow, they survived. So we've got genes that are very good at noticing threat and not so good at noticing joy and wonder and beauty. So that's why it's something that really we have to practice and to cultivate in our lives. And so there's a really simple way of doing this, and I invite you to try it, which is just to write down 10 things at the end of each day that you're grateful for. And if you're anything like me, you might get to number 7. It's usually 6 or 7, and I'm like, oh, really struggling to think of something. And that's when you're practicing your gratitude muscle, and you're growing it. And they're proven through brain scans that in practicing gratitude, you can actually strengthen that neuro pathway and become more and more predisposed to feel grateful. And if you think about the last time you felt grateful, and that lovely, warm, rushing feeling that gratitude is, it's very hard to feel stressed and anxious and angry alongside gratitude. So it's a wonderful resilience boost. And I chose this Bible verse: this is the day that the Lord has made, let us rejoice and be glad in it. So many times in the Bible, we are commanded to be grateful. It's very much seen as a practice, as a ritual, as something that we have to cultivate, as not something that human beings naturally do. And final word, growth. So actually, for me, this looks like some kind of journaling practice, but it can be perhaps seeing a spiritual accompanier or a spiritual director. It might be through talking with other people, but in some way, seeing your journey with climate change and the nature crisis as a discipleship, as something that you're growing in. If we are really kind of fixated on our arrival point of stopping climate change and stopping climate change and stopping climate change, then that can just lead to burnout. And I've found that instead, a goal for me is I'm going to be the best human I can be. I am going to grow in what it means to love under these really difficult circumstances. And I think about, you know, what is meaning making in this moment for me? And that's where the journaling comes helpful. And I also have a spiritual accompanier who helps me make sense of what's happening and create a story and listen to what God's story and God's calling is for me. So that can look a little bit different for everyone, but it's taking that time out to think, what's the big picture here that I'm engaging in? And it could be, for example, as well, go on a retreat or something like that to really make sense of our place and what we want to bring to this big story. The Bible verse I've chosen is, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. That's from Ephesians 4. So we've got there grace, some sort of daily stillness practice, grounding, time with the physical, gratitude, 10 things you're grateful for, and growth, meaning making in the journey. So there are some ideas. I'm going to pause there because I've gone slightly over time and just open up for some Q&A. I can also see there's something in the chat, someone just having turned off. But yeah, I don't know, Jen, how you want to do the Q&A part, but I'm happy to take any questions people have got, and I've got a couple of other things I can share at the end if there's time.
Thank you, Jo. So just wanted to say you said your gift of burnout, which struck me particularly, and I celebrate the way that you see that God has used that experience to bless others. I mean, there's Genesis 50:20, it's one of my favorite verses. God intends it for the ultimate good. And yes, so first question, and this is quite a heavy one. As a Christian, how do you respond if someone asks if the climate crisis is part of God's plan?
Well, it's been a lovely evening. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I probably respond with like, have you read the Bible? You know, there's this idea of this incredible, special, beautiful relationship between God and humanity. And it's not like we look at look at the climate crisis and we go, well, you know, we're all living such generous and giving lives, and yet out of nowhere this huge crisis is hitting the world. Like, no, we can see that it is human sin and greed and selfishness and self-interest, and we know that that God allows us to take the course that we will take, and I think it's impossible to know. I think it's impossible to know kind of how is God going to work all this together for good. And yet where I take hope is, I think at that moment when the disciples saw Jesus dying on the cross and they thought, there's no way that God can work this together for good. God had something up God's sleeve that was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened for humanity. And so in my moments of despair where I'm going, God, why aren't you stopping this? Why aren't you changing this? You know, I hear about another species that has gone extinct, or, you know, another catastrophe. I look at the cross and I think, I trust you. I trust you with this. And I respond to God's call to be a part of that healing and that restoration role that we are called to in the Bible. So yeah, I guess as well, the idea of God's will, I think it's God's always working in relationship with us, and God, you know, God will work with us with each turn that we take, and each wrong turn we might take, God will turn that for good and turn that for good and turn that for good. So yeah, that's how I live with it. That's how I live with it as a Christian, but I get asked that question a lot. That's how I live with it personally.
Thank you. And how have you found nature helpful in sustaining yourself and finding peace?
Right. So when my day job was to protect nature, I had never been more separate from nature than when it was my day job, because it was like board meetings, office, laptop. There was no time to get out and be in nature. And I think that really affected my work as well. One of the first things that led to my recovery from burnout was really setting aside that time to be in nature. And I had a full week where I did a kind of nature facilitation training, and they sent us off for a whole night to just sleep without a tent or anything, just in nature. And I'd never done anything like that before. And it was at the height of my burnout, you know, still in recovery. And as I was wanting my creature comforts because I wasn't feeling too good in myself. And I had this night under the stars, just feeling so held by God's creation and so held by God in creation. And as I lay there, and nature forgot that I was there and forgot that I was separate from nature, because I wasn't moving, I was just lying there. And so the birds were closer and closer, and the insects were closer and closer. And I realized, like, I am part of this, and I am held by this. And you know, we know all the mental health and physical benefits of being in nature, but actually taking that time to be with nature was totally transformational for me. I even woke up in the middle of the night, I turned over and opened my eyes, and there's this like slug that was like right here. It was making its way towards me. And this is the kind of thing I would not cope with normally. And instead, it was like so profound. I was like, oh, look at that slug. It's a miracle. So yeah, I think nature has been so profound for me. I do a huge amount of wild swimming now as well, like getting into nature, not just observing it, but getting into it. But even if it's just, you know, some people don't have much access, it's also, you know, hugely tied up with race and privilege and all of that. So even as just a house plant, that sense of being able to tend to and be in relationship with nature, and fulfill that role that we're called to actually tend and care, it does something very good for our souls, because I think that's kind of what we were born to do.
Great. At one point I thought you were going to say you were going to kiss the slug.
I should have done.
Maybe.
No.
So in a couple of lines, what would your message be to the church in regards to climate resilience and pastoral support?
Right. So a lot of people feel so lonely at the moment in life, but also if they're worrying about climate change, it can be very isolating. And the church one thing the church does really well is community. And this is not a crisis that we are designed to hold on our own. And as churches, we can hold this together. I did a climate grief course with the Good Grief Network, which was brilliant, back in January. And I went through the program with 10 other people. And I'd done, sort of a lot of resilience work, as you know, in the past on my own as an individual. But there was something about going through it with other people that was so transformational. And I think that's what church is. It's about community. So let's hold this crisis together as a community, because that is what we do, and that is what the world needs right now. So there's an incredible important role in terms of resilience building and climate for the church.
Great, thanks. And if you notice a colleague or friend showing signs of burnout, you can't always pin it, it's because of climate change, or obviously some of the stages apply wider than this. What would you do?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think about our assistant director at Hope for the Future, who's also a really good friend of mine, and she watched me go through my burnout and what she did for me, and it was the best. So I'll probably recommend what she did for me, which is, don't be afraid to raise it with the person. So I've noticed this, I've noticed that, are you okay? And give them time to just express what's going on for them if they want to. But sometimes people won't want to. Sometimes they need to go through that process. You can raise it with them. You can say, why don't you talk to your line manager if it's in a work position, or go see a GP, or have you thought about having some therapy? Signpost them to places of support. But sometimes we need to reach crisis to realize that we need help. And so in that instance, it's being alongside that person, being there for them as a consistent presence, whilst also being mindful of your own needs and your own self-care, modeling that to them with healthy boundaries and all of that. But really validating their experience as well. Really important, just being alongside each other. We can't fix this. And, just overnight, we can't fix climate change. We often can't fix other people's problems. We often cannot even fix our own problems. That's why so many of us go to God. And when I ask people, what's the number one thing that helps you with the research that I do, it isn't, I just wish climate change was gone, I wish I had this, or it was just, I just wish I had someone to share this with. That's the number one thing we need. It's just to share, to know I'm not alone. And so that's what I'd say, is be that place to share, because that's how we make sense of what's happening to us as well.
Thanks for sharing, Jo. If anyone has a question, would they like to unmute, or you can write in the chat?
Jo, that's been just fantastic. I've written, I know I could have got your presentation, but I've kind of written down everything you said. It's so full of stuff, that is so helpful. And I've been campaigning, as you know, much too long. I'm really interested to ask, from your perspective, as somebody I see as a young campaigner, do you see any difference in your experience in the generations, in their propensity to burn out, in their willingness to talk about it? As I say, I've been campaigning a very long time, and in hindsight, I have seen this happen. But your generation has always seemed to me much more self-aware than my generation, and that's my impression. I'm interested what it looks like to you. Because you know some older campaigners too. What does it look like to you? I'm not asking you to rate the generation. I'm saying, what do you think the differences are? Because I think we might be in different places, even in our ability to acknowledge there's a problem, never mind doing something about it.
Yeah, that's such a great question and observation. And I probably don't have masses to add to your observation, other than that there's been so much movement in terms of mental health and awareness, and particularly over the pandemic, there's been this amazing kind of awakening to the fact that our mental health is as big and important as our physical health. It's not just like this little side thing that we need to take care of. And I think that is much more ingrained in younger generations, to talk about that. I think it's also more ingrained in women to talk about that and to care give, therefore to experience burnout, but also to be literate in how they experience that. So I think there's gender as well as generation. But what I'd also say is older generations will have been through inevitably personal crises or challenges that they've learned tools about how to overcome those. And I see, a sense, for example, of sensible, I can give this much and not that much. Like they've learned over time about boundaries, or they've learned about self-care through practice. And I think for a lot of young people, like there's so much passion and so much drive, and then there's this like awful experience of burnout. So I think there's probably like strengths and weaknesses depending on where you are in your generation. And then put on top of that older people have children and grandchildren, that can actually be more distressing than worrying about your own life, is actually worrying about those that you care about, because you're less in control of that. So that can be an additional challenge as well. But then there's people my age, like, do I want to bring children into it? So it's so multifaceted. Yeah, that would be my observations. Yes, you've just like summarized it brilliantly. Older may have experience, younger have the language and the professional insights. Yeah.
So we face a ridiculous number of choices, which can be very stressful. How do you cope with trying to make good eco choices?
Step one, know that you will make bad eco choices every single day, and let go of the idea that you're going to be able to get this right. And we know from our Christian faith that it's not about getting everything right that makes us a valid and worthwhile human. So that would be my first bit of advice. And then my second is to think of yourself as being in relationship with your carbon footprint. So it's an ongoing dialogue, it's an ongoing relationship. What happens if I change this? What happens if I don't change this? Take an attitude, if you can, of curiosity towards your carbon footprint. At the end of the day, it is these big global systems that cause climate change, not our individual lifestyle changes. And so that releases me from this sense of enormous guilt and shame and judgment and overwhelm. And from that place, I have found I make many, many more sustainable choices than I otherwise would, because I'm released from that awful sense of burden. And then from that place of, because I love creation, because I care for creation, because I want to be the best human I can, rather than because I feel ashamed of myself or guilty, I choose this or I choose that. And I found that that's so much more sustainable. So it's an art, like it's a discipleship. It's a learning how to be the best human that you can be, and it takes practice, and it's not just like a set of goals to tick off. At least for me, it isn't. That would be my advice. It is so overwhelming, and we don't really have a roadmap for it, because these are kind of impossible choices that we are making at this moment in time. There's a quote I want to read by Anne Voskamp that you might know. She wrote a book called 1,000 Gifts. It's a Christian book, and I just love I just love this quote. It says, "I know there is poor and hideous suffering, and I've seen the hungry and the guns that go to war. I have lived pain, and my life can tell. I only deepen the wound of the world when I neglect to give thanks for early light dappled through leaves, and the heavy perfume of wild roses in early July, and the song of crickets on humid nights, and the rivers that run, and the seas that rise, and the stars that rise, and the rain that falls, and all the good things that a good God gives. Why would the world need more anger and more outrage?" That was Anne Voskamp, 1,000 Gifts. And so I love that quote, and I'm going to share with you a poem, and it's a video. So it's by Harry Baker. It's called Impossible. I need to share my sound, make sure it's right, get rid of this, bring up this. As you can see, it's 3 minutes long. Oh, hopefully the screen will stop being green. Here we go.
I'm finding it too easy to tell myself it is too hard, when facing the end that it's too late to even make a start. But if we take impossible to mean that we don't have a chance, we have lost sight of how unlikely it was we would get this far. The way the single fish outwits a shark by sticking with its school. The way the crescent moon outspins its dark to once again be full. Even winter, given long enough, begins to lose its cool. That which was once exceptional now barely registers at all. Flamingos and giraffes look like they were drawn by a child. We can't begin to comprehend all of the ways this world is wild. None of them asked if they were possible before they came to be. None of them have ceased to exist by being told they make believe. The bug who finds it all too much and tries to shut off everything. To have recovered and then summoned up the strength to stretch its wings, the snake, so full of itself that it cannot help but shed its skin. Or how instead of death, the hedgehog went to bed and slept till spring. To think the earth exists at this specific distance from the sun, down to the angle of the axis on which everything is spun, the fact that trees happen to breathe that which we need inside our lungs, would all seem impossible had it not already been done. We are impossible to everyone who's ever gone before, and everyone who's yet to come will push impossible some more. Just as indeed the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. So everything's impossible until it isn't. The thought of rivers changing course before somebody gave a damn, or that a tide might turn from shore before a line's drawn in the sand. We cannot know how far our actions go, the impact they might have. Sometimes the only thing that we can do is to do all we can. Just as the night is at its darkest when it's introduced to day. Just as the dry is at its harshest in the breath before it rains. It's easy enough to believe in something when it's all okay, but it's when times are at the hardest that it's hardest to have faith. Yet when the light begins to fade, that's when we need it the most. It's by surviving day to day that we see seasons evolve. If there was never any doubt, there'd be no reason for hope. It could be too late to do anything. It sure as hell is if we don't. And I am tired of that doom and gloom and self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm trying to find room to bloom and self-fulfill the opposite. When it's an act of revolution to try stay remotely positive, there's nothing wishy-washy about opting to be optimists. Whether a brighter future is possible, we may not truly know. But the first step towards that future is imagining it so. And so as indeed the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. It only stays impossible until it isn't. And when it's over, and we're no more than old bones within the ground, still the soil knows to sow its seed from what is broken down. What is lost is always lost until the moment it is found. And these things only ever go one way unless we turn them round. We are so constantly surrounded that it's easy to forget. This world was built upon impossible that has not stopped us yet. So yes, indeed, the do's we did outdo the don'ts we didn't. So it remains impossible until it isn't.
My taskbar just came up at the bottom there, which was hiding the lyrics. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, it was Impossible by Harry Baker, and I love that poem. Final thing I'd say from me is that if you'd like to stay in touch with my work, I run a Facebook group called Selfcare for Climate Activists, and in there's all sorts of sort of free resilience strategies, and I share sort of weekly mailings in there, and there's a lovely community as well. So there's the link from Hannah, she's popped that in the chat. So if you're on Facebook and you want to stay in touch, then you can do that then. And yes, the name of that poem is Impossible by Harry Baker, for Luke who's asking. But yeah, that's all from me. I'll hand back to you, Jen, and just thank you so much for having me and being willing to partake in what's quite a vulnerable subject. I've enjoyed myself.
Thank you, Jo, for sharing with us so openly and giving us some great tools. I especially like the have a nap one. I'll remember. Have it when you really need one. And thank you for everyone for taking part as well. So this is a Wild Christian event, and we'd encourage you to sign up to Wild Christian to receive our monthly email with practical ideas on how to enjoy, nurture and defend nature, and have the opportunity to connect with others at events like this one. And we have a soon to be launched Facebook group too. We plan to hold more of these events with expert speakers, campaign takeaway events where we take a campaign action online together, and we also have practical events. So this year we're doing something different as a Rosh UK. We have Act for Nature Days at our at some of our reserve and partners. Hannah will put the links for them in the chat. There's Wolfields is our first one, June the 25th in West London. For anyone in Northern Ireland or with connections there, there's an event at Hughes Meadow on July the 23rd. In the autumn, there is one at our Foxearth Meadows Rural Reserve in North Essex. That's September the 3rd, sorry, and our partner Hillfield Friary in Dorset, November the 12th. So you should have them linked. I can put them in the follow-up email. And I just wanted to pray before we finish. So Heavenly Father, we thank you for your beautiful earth and for those working to protect it. We pray for those at the front line, for their protection and for courage. We pray your blessing on Jo and all those she is helping through her coaching work and speaking. We pray for Christians here in the UK and for each one of us represented on this call. Many are from eco-churches involved in local green groups and initiatives and campaigns. So bless their work, Lord, and grant them your strength. We pray for those feeling particularly isolated in that work. Give them people that care about your creation to journey with. And may what Jo has shared with us tonight speak into our lives too. And you know where we are this evening, Lord. If we're feeling overwhelmed or energized to take action, and maybe even both, renew us and renew our commitment to caring for your earth in our homes, churches and communities. As we face the accelerating twin biodiversity and climate crisis and take action, remind us to rest in your grace and be rooted always in you. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely rest of the evening.